pa ma pa pa ma ga re sa re ni re ni re ga ma pa pa ga pa ma ga re sa re ga 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 ma pa da pa sa sa re re sa pa ma ga re sa sa re sa ni da pa ma pa da pa da ni sa ni da pa ma pa da pa ma ga re sa re ga ma pa da ni sa ga ga pa ma ga ni sa re sa ni da pa ma pa ma ga re sa re ni re ga ma ga re sa.
The Center for Microfinance is pretty unique. It's the only center which is focusing only on microfinance research, and the only center which is doing such experimental work on microfinance. I'm going to talk mostly about the research unit today, but we also have another unit which has been created more recently, which is called the MFI Strategy Unit, MSU, which is a consulting unit for microfinance institutions. The collection of rigorous data on microfinance is extremely important because otherwise we are left with just anecdotes or stories that people can use as they like. We focus on three main areas. One is impact of microfinancial services. The second is project design of various financial services. And the third is microfinance plus, combination of microfinance and other development interventions. So to give you an example of these three areas, we are conducting an impact evaluation of the microcredit program of Spandana in Hyderabad. For the second work area, product design, we are conducting an impact evaluation and experimentation on product design of weather insurance with Seva in Gujarat. And finally, for the Microfinance Plus, we are conducting the impact evaluation of mosquito nets provided through microcredit with an institution called BISVA in Odisha, in a very malaria-prone area.
Does microfinance lift people out of poverty? Does microfinance help empower women? Does microfinance reduce the debt burden of the poor? Or does it lead them to borrow too much? Does microfinance clients start new businesses? Or do their businesses become more profitable? Does microfinance reduce their clients' vulnerability to shocks? Does microfinance lead to improvement in children's education? Or does it lead to increase in child labor?
We offer financial services to low-income households who otherwise can't access these services from mainstream banks and financial institutions because like these banks demand collateral and poor people like they're not in a position to offer collateral security. So we offer them financial services, and right now we are operating in 25 districts of 2 states, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, and we have reached out almost like 800,000 poor women and in few places also like men.
సభ్యురాలిగా చేరిన నేను నా కుటుంబం కొరకు కష్టపడి పనిచేస్తాను. సంస్థ నుండి తీసుకున్న రుణాన్ని సకాలంలో చెల్లిస్తాను. నా తోటి సభ్యులకు కష్టకాలంలో సహాయపడతాను. నేను చేయు ప్రతి పనికి చెప్పు ప్రతి మాటకు దేవుడే సాక్ష్యం.
After giving loan, we often meet our clients and we ask them like in what way you have really benefited out of this loan. And I heard like so many stories wherein they say that like there is a great impact on my husband because like since we had to really repay this loan every week, and he stopped taking liquor and he stopped smoking. And also like some women, they say that since we didn't have much work to do, like we were simply moving here and there and we were idle, but now like since there is a kind of stabilized business, like I saw my husband completely involved into the business, and he's no more really roaming aside, and some women, they say that like my status in the family improved a lot because my family members started respecting me a lot because I'm doing a business, I'm earning, and I'm sending my children to school. And some women, they say that like my own status in the society has improved a lot because people who were not really considering me as a human being started identifying me as a good entrepreneur.
ట్రైనింగ్ తీసుకున్నాను, కానీ బ్యూటిషియన్ పెట్టుకోవడానికి ట్రైనింగ్కి కూడా డబ్బులు చాలా ప్రాబ్లం అయింది. ఈ స్పందన సంస్థ ఏర్పడిందని తెలిసింది. ఇక్కడ నుంచి లోన్ తీసుకొని కొద్దిగా ట్రైనింగ్ అని కొంచెం నేను ఐటమ్స్ తీసుకొని వచ్చి చేద్దామని అనుకున్నాను. ఫస్ట్ ట్రిప్లో నాకు ఛాన్స్ దొరకలేదు. ఇలా సెకండ్ 10 మెంబర్స్ అయ్యేటప్పటికి నాకు గ్రూప్లో నాకు కూడా మెంబర్షిప్ దొరికింది. నేను కూడా తీసుకొనేసి కొన్ని ఐటమ్స్ తీసుకొని వచ్చాను. ఆల్రెడీ ఇంకా కూడా కొంచెం ప్రాక్టీస్ మొత్తం అయిపోయింది. ఇంకా బాడీ మసాజ్ అది 1-2 ఉన్నాయి. ఆల్రెడీ ఇంకా ట్రైనింగ్కి వెళ్తున్నాను. ఇక్కడ నుంచి తీసుకున్న డబ్బులు కొన్ని అక్కడ కట్టేశాను, ఒక 3000. మిగతా కొన్ని ఐటమ్స్ తీసుకొచ్చాను. ఇంకా చైర్కి వాటికి ఆర్డర్ ఇచ్చాను. ఇక్కడైతే ఇప్పుడు బాగానే కస్టమర్స్ వస్తున్నారు. ఐబ్రోస్ అవి చేస్తూ ఉంటాను. నేను దీని నుంచి నాకు ఇంట్లో కూడా బాగా ఉపయోగపడుతున్నాయి. ఒకరికి నేను ఐబ్రోస్ చేశానంటే 10-15 రూపీస్, ఒక మెంబర్ చేశాను అనుకోండి 15 రూపీస్ వస్తుంది నాకు. ఇట్లా తీసుకొని నేను ఇవి చేసినందుకు నాకు చాలా సంతోషంగా ఉంది మేడం.
ఖర్చు ఎంత ఉంటుంది?
ఖర్చు ఎక్కువ ఏమి ఉండదు మేడం. ఇది క్రీమ్స్కి కొంచెం ఎక్కువ పడతాయి, కాస్మెటిక్స్కి. ఈ థ్రెడ్ వచ్చేసి 25 రూపీస్ అలా ఉంటుంది. ఈ థ్రెడ్ వచ్చి చాలామందికి ఉపయోగపడుతుంది. దీని బ్యూటీషియన్ నుంచి అయితే చాలా లాభమే ఉంటుంది మేడం. ఎక్కువ ఖర్చు తక్కువ ఉంటుంది, లాభం మనకు బాగానే ఉంటుంది. ఎక్కువగా మెంబర్స్ కొంచెం వచ్చేదాన్ని బట్టి ఉంటుంది.
మా షాప్ పెట్టేసి విన్నర్స్ డ్రైక్లింగ్ షాప్ అండి. అది పెట్టేసి 45 years అవుతుంది. ఇప్పుడు కొంచెం డౌన్ అయిందన్నమాట. అక్కడి నుంచి షాప్ తీసేసినాము. దానికోసం లోన్ తీసాము మేము. లోన్ తీసి కొంచెం ఈ కర్రలు తక్కువ ఉండే, దాంట్లో లోన్ తీసి కొంచెం మేము కొన్ని డబ్బులు వేసి 10,000 అట్లా పెట్టి ఈ కర్రలు తీసుకున్నాము మొన్ననే సెకండ్ హ్యాండ్లో. ఇప్పుడు కొంచెం డెవలప్ అవుతుంది. ఆయన పేరు హస్బెండ్, మా హస్బెండ్ అతను అది చేసి మా హ్యాండ్. 2 బాబులు, మా ఆడబిడ్డ ఉంది. మా ఫ్యామిలీ వాళ్ళమే చేసుకుంటాం అంత పని, బయట వాళ్ళది ఇవ్వలేరు. మిషన్లు కూడా కొంచెం బయట ఉన్నాయి, తెచ్చుకొని కొన్ని మంచిగా చేసుకోవాలని చూసుకుంటున్నాము.
We know like what's happening out of the microfinance program, but the whole world has to really understand what's happening because of the microfinance program. So if that has to be done, means like there should be data, there should be research, and there should be impact evaluations. So I hope that like this particular impact evaluation would really enlighten the whole world on what's happening out of microfinance program.
So impact evaluation are critical because we need to know what works and what doesn't in order to improve the effectiveness of any anti-poverty program. So in general, we need to know whether it's better to invest in textbook or in flip chart for schools. We need to know whether microfinance really help the poor and how much it helps the poor. Spandana selected 120 communities, little slums, little basties within the city, which they were willing to leave aside for the study. So it's 120 small slums. And in those 120, we randomly picked 60. And in those 60, they were going to start their program right away. And in the remaining 60, they were not going to start their program for at least 1 year, but probably more. Before they entered anywhere, we did a baseline survey. And then they started lending, and currently people are borrowing. And we are now waiting until people have borrowed and the effect start to show or start to, you can reasonably affect the effect to show up. And then we'll do another survey in both types of community. And because the 60 communities where they entered were randomly selected, all we will have to do in order to know the impact of the program is to compare a variety of outcomes that we've collected in those surveys across the places where Spandana started the program and across the places where they've not started it yet. It will help Spandana because knowing which area are impacted by microfinance will help thinking about the product in a richer way. So for example, we might find that microfinance really doesn't change the average consumption, but it changes the variability of the consumption a lot. So we would see that microcredit plays a role that is closer to an insurance role. So having learned that, we are thinking about the product in a different way. After a huge development of the sector in the past few years, The sector is now under some kind of attack, in particular in Andhra Pradesh, one of the states where it is the most developed.
The district collector gave a press statement to everybody saying that they don't have to really repay any loan to any microfinance organization. But people because they did not really took that very seriously and they started repaying. And after that press statement also we got 100% on-time repayment almost for 4-5 days. And the district collector was so angry and then he seized all the branches of all microfinance organizations in the district, and they seized all registers, records, and they have simply thrown out all the staff from our branch offices, and we were not able to operate almost for 3-4 weeks. And then we appealed to the state government and the chief minister, and we told them this is what happened. But later on the branches were unseized and they were open, but still there is no normalcy.
There have been press articles, and there have been all sorts of debates, and there have been very, very nasty and critical articles saying about microfinance that it really doesn't help the poor. In fact, it hurts them by putting them into a sort of a debt crisis and by putting them under stress when they feel obliged to repay, etc. And the interest rates are too high, etc., etc. So that's what the critics are saying. And on the other hand, the microfinance community is saying, no, that's not like that. On the contrary, despite the high interest rate, the poor are really benefiting because the activities that they are able to finance with these microfinance loans at returns are even higher. So the poor are really benefiting. But we really need to have an answer to this question, and the only way to have an answer to this question is to do an impact evaluation. So at this point, if the microfinance sector had a good impact evaluation at its disposal, it could say, no, you are just lying. In fact, we have this data to show that microfinance really help the poor in this and this and this way.
વરસાદ ઉપર જ બીજું કઈ નહીં.
વરસાદના કરે બાદ કરે તો બળી જાય. શું કરવાનું હોય? વરસાદ ના પડે તો કે કુવા દોડે ના હોય, કોઈ પાણી ના હોય તો શું કરવાનું પછી? કશું થયું અનાજ નતું પાકતું કશું.
અરે કોઈડા પાક બાંક વાવ્યો તો એ ટાઈમે અનાજ
વાય પણ આવું બળી ગયું. વાય પણ વરસાદ ના આવે એટલે બધું બળી સાફ થઈ.
Historically, farmers and landless laborers have been subject to extreme risk in the case of drought or flooding. Many countries have offered crop insurance to farmers. So the United States does this, India does this. And this is typically done not based on the yield that the individual farmer receives, but based on the yield in the area. So in India, for example, they'll have sample cutting farms where they'll harvest all the grain on the farm and they'll measure how much grain it was. There's several problems with this. First, it's very costly to do these measurements. And the yield on farm 2 kilometers away or 10 kilometers away may not be that highly correlated with the yield on the farmer's land. But notionally, it's a pretty good idea. Weather insurance is different because it's just based on the rainfall. Or in the next generation of products, it's going to be based on rainfall, wind, hail, anything that you can measure very precisely and at very low cost. So throughout India, the government and the National Commodities Exchange are setting up weather stations that measure meteorological features every day. And then it becomes very simple to write an insurance policy on this because typically you have historical data dating back 10, 20, 30 years about the rainfall in that region. Climatological models are reasonably well understood. So when you ask a private party to take on the rainfall risk, they can price it because they have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen next year with respect to rainfall. Rainfall insurance in India has started out with some 200 or 300 policies in the first year and has now expanded to reach 20 or 30,000 people. Yet we still don't understand how effective it is. It's critically important to understand how beneficial weather insurance is. Are people buying it simply because it's novel, or is it something that's going to make a profound impact on their lives? We're optimistic for the latter, but unless we conduct an evaluation, we cannot know how weather insurance affects individuals' consumption and risk-taking behavior.
We together, trying to do a research into, what is an appropriate kind of product, what is the affordability of our members, what are the kinds of, what are the periods when our members, are very hard hit and, therefore they are more vulnerable, which is that time frame during the monsoon season. So we, the research covers all these parameters and then also designing the appropriate product and also how do you market it.
This product has some unique features like it covers deficit rainfall as well as excess rainfall. The other two products that we have in India cover deficit rainfall only. Moreover, this product is broken down into three phases: sowing, growing and harvesting, three stages. So the three phases of this insurance are supposed to by and large match the three phases of the crop cycle. Each phase is a separate unit in itself and separate triggers or the level of rainfall below which the payout will start. All the three of the three stages have separate triggers, and in this particular product which we have offered, the third stage covers excess rainfall and the first two phases cover deficit rainfall only.
One innovation in this project was to introduce the product to landless laborers. They're very dependent on the weather because if there's no crop to harvest, nobody will hire them and they have little other choice to work in the area. They're usually obliged to migrate far away. One trade-off we face in the insurance policy is a trade-off between the complexity of the product and the transparency of the instrument. So, for example, if the policy just paid 1,000 rupees if rainfall was above 200 millimeters and nothing if it were below that level, then the product would be very simple. People would be able to understand it, but it wouldn't be a great product. It's better for them to provide a more continuous payout scale that compensates them to the degree of loss they receive. But then the product gets more complicated. You have to explain for each 5 millimeters rainfall deficit, you get an extra 10 rupees or an extra 30 rupees, and it becomes much harder. So one experiment we did in the fields was to try and mimic the situation that the farmers faced.
30 રૂપિયા મળે બરાબર, પણ જો 100 મિલીમીટરથી 150 મિલીમીટર વરસાદ પડ્યો હોય તો ઇન્સ્યોરન્સ કંપની તમને વળતર ના આપે, કેમ કે બહુ સારું કહેવાય વરસાદ એટલે તમારે વળતરની જરૂર જ ના પડે. એટલે તમારે હવે નક્કી કરવાનું તમારે વીમો લેવો છે કે નથી લેવો. લેવો છે વીમો એટલે આ કાયમી વીમો નથી, ખાલી ગેમ પૂરતો જ બરાબર. અને ગેમ તમે વીમો લઈને પણ ગેમ રમી શકો છો અને વીમો ના લેવો હોય તો પણ તમે પછીથી પણ ગેમ રમી શકો છો. ના વીમો લેવો છે તમારે, સારું. તો આ 30 રૂપિયા તમારે ભરવાના રહેશે પાછા, બરાબર છે. હવે આપણે ગેમ ચાલુ કરીશું. પત્તું ખેંચો. હા, પત્તું ખેંચી લો તમે. 130 મિલીમીટર વરસાદ પડ્યો બરાબર, તો તમને મજૂરીને કેટલા મળે એ તમને પહેલા સમજાયું ને, ભૂલી ગયા. 110 મિલીમીટરથી 140 મિલીમીટર 150 મિલીમીટર વરસાદ પડ્યો હોય તો મજૂરીના 2 અઠવાડિયા મજૂરી મળે અને કેટલા મળે 60 રૂપિયા બરાબર. હવે તમે ઇન્સ્યોરન્સ લીધો છે 130 મિલીમીટર વરસાદ એટલે ઘણો સારું કહેવાય વરસાદ, એટલે ઇન્સ્યોરન્સ કંપની તમને વળતર ના આપે પણ તમને મજૂરીના તમારા 60 રૂપિયા મળે, બરાબર છે. એટલે આ 60 રૂપિયા તમને મળશે. અહીંયા આપણી ગેમ પૂરી થઈ ગઈ, બરાબર છે.
So to some people we offered a very complicated insurance policy that was actually better suited. So if you stepped back as an economist and you analyzed this policy, you'd say, no, this is the best policy because the payments varied continuously and it hedged against different types of risks that were in the packs of cards. And then we also offered them a simple insurance policy that wasn't quite as attractive from a theoretical perspective, but it was much more transparent. And we found then that people preferred to buy the simple policy. We'd like to extend this result and see if education can be effective. So if we spend some time explaining them how they might evaluate the product, weigh the pros and cons, would they then prefer the superior product or would they still prefer the inferior product because it's more simple? So by learning how consumers think about insurance contracts, we can better understand how to design the insurance contracts and how to market them. Everybody in the village is dependent on rainfall because they all work on a farm or have income-generating activities that are related to agriculture. So if there's a terrible drought or horrible flood, everybody suffers, and there's nobody to turn to for help. This is exactly the type of risk that finance theory tells us should be diversified. People in the U.S. Should be willing to take on this risk because it's uncorrelated with the stock market or other types of their assets. But traditionally that's not been possible because it's been too expensive to write a contract where somebody in the U.S. or some Swiss insurance company takes on farmer or laborer's risk. However, with the advent of index-based weather insurance, the contracting costs have come down so low that it's possible for anybody to take on this risk. And I'm actually pretty excited by this. I could see in the future that there could be just a general risk market where farmers could purchase insurance and people on the other side of the contract may be insurance companies, or even well-wishers in the United Kingdom or the U.S. who could say, I'm going to take $100 of weather insurance risk at a compensation of maybe an expected return of 5%, and I'm happy to do this because it gives me as much return as my savings. It's a very small amount of money for me. But then the farmer on the other side of the transaction in India, who could be connected through simple electronic markets, would be able to hedge this risk.
Can we adapt the product to our members' needs without the research? Then I think it is a trial and error that one will have to go through, and you cannot play with a poor woman and her household's minimal income, and therefore we feel that the research is really, really very important.
The state of Orissa has around 5% of the total population in India, and it is one of the poorest states. In 2000, if you look at the malaria cases in India, there were around 200,000, out of which 100,000 alone were falciparum cases, which is a cerebral malaria. Orissa alone accounts for more than 62% of the malaria deaths in the country.
There is a very strong association between the regular use of ITNs, insecticide-treated bed nets, and a reduction in malaria incidents. On one hand, leads to the consequence that you are not bitten by a mosquito, which can potentially transmit malaria to you. If you do have malaria and you sleep under a bed net, a mosquito will not bite you, and so it's also less likely that you will transmit malaria to somebody else through the mosquito itself. It's also been shown that something else which is extremely important is not only to sleep regularly under a bed net, but also to treat these bed nets with chemicals. And of course the reason here is the fact that if you simply sleep under an untreated net, you are not bitten if you use it properly, but if you also use chemicals, mosquitoes die almost instantly, depending also on what kind of chemical you use. But so a further reason why use of ITNs may reduce malaria incidence is that you can kill 20, 30, 40, hundreds of mosquitoes every night, depending on how many mosquitoes there are in the area. Microfinance can really help increasing the uptake of these measures because households will be allowed to relax credit constraints, and so if you allow a household to spread a cost of 100, 200, 300 rupees over a year, they may be much more willing to buy the bed net.
The people in the village, they are financially not that sound. The BPL category people, due to the financial constraint and due to ignorance also sometimes, they do not have mosquito nets.
What we'd like to be able to do is to have different sorts of loan products for each type of insecticide-treated net, and also for the actual sequence of retreatments. There are sort of three goals of the project, broadly speaking. The first one, and the most directly relevant to microfinance, is to see to what extent we can use microfinance to provide health interventions like insecticide-treated nets. The other sort of broader aim of this project is to try to understand how people think about health interventions in these kinds of situations, what kinds of what kinds of information, what kind of interventions can we effect to try and understand how people take these decisions, and how can we, in some sense, effect some sort of behavioral change in this environment. And the third goal, which is sort of the most straightforward in some sense, is a program evaluation sort of goal, which is to try and understand, to try and quantify really what are the effects as rigorously as possible of providing insecticide-treated nets via microfinance to outcomes such as health, or also things like days lost due to work or schooling, medical expenditure. While there are very well documented studies that look at the effect of ITNs on reductions in mortality and morbidity, the link from there to actual improvements in income, expenditure, or household welfare more generally defined, I think is quite an important issue, and certainly it certainly is something that households are going to take into account when they're going to decide whether or not to invest money in an ITN. And so trying to actually put a number to that, I think, would actually be quite useful.
गुटे मसारी अछि तो मसारी टांगु छी के
नाही तो आई
के नै लगा काई नै लगा कारण का
गुटे मसारी अछि डबल आ पाखे पाखे तो सुई छना बेले के ना गुटे लगी असुविधा
खर्चा कितना होता है आपको वो जो प्रॉब्लम्स है हेल्थ के लिए एक वर्ष में
अंदाज रे
किछि त ठीक ठिकना नै जत्ते बड़ा है ना से
को तते अंदाज रे
फिर भी 5-7 थर दे जाई
केते 5-7 वर्ष को बोले थरे गले केते खर्चा हो
थरे गले 1000 टका सब टका जदी जणे बेड रे जदी पड़ी गला आहुरी भी खर्चा हो जाई.
We know that bouts of malaria are typically associated with several days of schooling or work lost. And this means that if you have malaria and you lose 3 or 4 days of work, for instance, and you are a daily wage laborer, this may reduce your income, and reduced income may reduce the ability to pay as a consequence.
The bottom line level for BISWA would be that it would enable them to improve their repayment rates.
We are also looking at the health aspects, because if you will not see the health aspects, then the credit depending, the credit absorption capacity will gradually decrease, and that's why we agreed with the Center for Microfinance to do this work.
So in that sense, BISWA as an MFI will benefit a lot more, because now they can do high volume loans, and the transaction costs obviously will reduce, so it makes business sense for them.
I think there's a lot of renewed attention on malaria in the past maybe 10 or 15 years to do with how to deal with malaria, and in part I think it's come about because of the failure of the global eradication of malaria program that sort of people pretty much gave up on in the 70s, and I think also the increased realization that there's been a lot of money spent on trying to find a malaria vaccine, while there are a lot of relatively cheap interventions that people can undertake that have the potential at least of reducing malaria morbidity drastically. Now, to go from saying that we actually have available cheap interventions that can reduce malaria mortality and morbidity to actually the adoption of these interventions by populations on a large scale is actually a very, very difficult question. So while it's true that ITNs are relatively cheap and have documented health benefits in terms of reducing malaria morbidity, to actually achieve the kind of targets that the malaria experts talk about is really a very difficult thing to do without having some understanding of how people take these decisions to adopt these kind of nets or not. So I think that in a best case scenario, this project would sort of contribute to that conversation and try and at least have some understanding of how we can enable households or poor households to actually adopt these interventions and then potentially think about whether these can be scaled up.
In addition to these questions which have been illustrated in the movie, one thing that the recent crisis in Andhra Pradesh in the microfinance sector has revealed is that we know very little about the microfinance sector, even about things that we were never questioning. How do MFIs operate? What are the strategies of the loan officers to get back their loans? What do people use loans for? This last question is important not because microfinance institutions should lend only for productive purposes, something that we often hear, but because it is important to know what clients are borrowing for in order to design the right products for what the clients need. The role of the Center for Microfinance is to go beyond anecdotal evidence and to collect rigorous data on the microfinance sector. We conduct both short-term studies and long-term studies in order to answer two questions. How can we help expand the access of microfinance? And how can we help improve the quality of existing microfinancial services?